Welcome back to Mad Hatter's Civil War History. In this episode, we explore William Collins and the story of Andersonville. When the Civil War began, neither side expected a long conflict. Although there was no formal exchange system at the beginning of the war, both armies paroled prisoners. Captured men were conditionally released on their oath of honor not to return to battle. This allowed them to return to camps of instruction as non-combatants. It also meant that neither side had to provide for their prisoners' needs. An exchange system set up in 1862 lasted less than a year. North and South found themselves with thousands of prisoners of war. The prisoner exchanges functioned well until December of 1862, when Confederate President Jefferson Davis suspended the parole of Union officers following the execution of William Mumford, a New Orleans citizen, by Union General Benjamin F. Butler earlier that year. In reaction, Union Secretary Stanton ordered a halt to all exchanges of commissioned officers. Further difficulties developed when the Confederate government refused to parole and exchange any African American soldiers taken captive who might have escaped from slavery. Confederate authorities decided instead to treat these prisoners as runaways, suitable only for return to their former owners. In March of 1863, the Confederate exchange agent Robert Ould sent a letter to Jefferson Davis with these complaints about the Union's exchange efforts. I am more and more satisfied every day that the federal government does not intend to keep faith with us in the matter of prisoners or exchanges. I believe its officials are taxing their ingenuity to find out the most available methods of deceit and fraud. I received yesterday official evidence that some 40 officers entitled long ago to their release and who in fact are exchanged under existing agreements are now imprisoned at Camp Chase, and yet the federal agent, with an earnestness intended to be particularly impressive, assured me 3 days ago that not one of these officers was confined in that place. Not one day passes that some evidence does not come to hand of Yankee fraud and mendacity. 4 weeks ago, the federal agent informed me in writing that it was not the intention of his government to make any more arrests of non-combatants in our territory, and yet more have been made since the declaration than during any previous equal space of time. By early 1863, the exchanges had effectively stopped. In the South, captured Union soldiers were first housed in old warehouses and barns. As the number of prisoners increased following the end of regular exchanges in 1863, camps were built specifically as prisons in Florence, South Carolina, Millen and Andersonville, Georgia, and many other locations. Most were wooden stockades enclosing open fields. In the North, officials converted many federal camps of instruction into prisons. Stockades were placed around Camp Butler in Illinois, Camp Chase in Ohio, and camps at Elmira, New York. Other Confederate prisoners were held at Fort McHenry in Baltimore and Fort Warren in Boston Harbor. The confined soldiers suffered terribly. The most common problems confronting prisoners, both North and South, were overcrowding, poor sanitation, and inadequate food. Mismanagement by prison officials, as well as by the prisoners themselves, worsened matters. The end of the war saved hundreds of prisoners from an untimely death, but for many, the war's end came too late. Of the 194,732 Union soldiers held in Confederate prison camps, some 30,000 died while captive. Among them, my great-grandfather, Philip Haddle. Union forces held about 220,000 Confederate prisoners, nearly 26,000 of whom died. Commonly known as Andersonville, the military prison facility was officially named Camp Sumter in honor of the county in which it was located. Construction of the camp began in early 1864 after the decision was made to relocate Union prisoners to a more secure location. This decision was made because of the battles taking place near Richmond, Virginia, where many prisoners were being held, and to procure a greater food supply. Camp Sumter was only in operation for 14 months. However, during that time, 45,000 Union soldiers were imprisoned there, and nearly 13,000 died from disease, poor sanitation, malnutrition, overcrowding, or exposure. The prison site initially covered approximately 16.5 acres of land, which was enclosed by a 15-foot-high stockade wall. The prison was enlarged in June of 1864 to 26.5 acres to compensate for overpopulation. The stockade was constructed in the shape of a parallelogram that was 1,620 feet long and 779 feet wide. Approximately 19 feet inside of the stockade wall was the deadline, which the prisoners were not allowed to cross. If a prisoner stepped over the deadline, the guards in the pigeon roost, which were roughly 30 yards apart, were allowed to shoot them. The first prisoners arrived at Camp Sumter in late February of 1864. Over the course of the next few months, approximately 400 prisoners arrived daily. By June of 1864, over 26,000 prisoners were confined in a stockade designed to house 10,000 people. The largest number of prisoners held at one time was 33,000 in August of 1864. The Confederate government was unable to provide the prisoners with adequate housing, food, clothing, and medical care. Due to the terrible conditions, prisoners suffered greatly, and a high mortality rate ensued. As the cloth sack slipped over his face, closing his eyes to the crowd of disheveled, emaciated faces, eagerly baying for his blood, you have to wonder whether William Collins's mind drifted back to the streets of Nottingham he'd grown up on. Just how had this Knots-born former knitter found himself as chief villain in one of American Civil War's darkest stories? There wasn't a single sympathetic face among the 26,000 onlookers packed into a filthy and overcrowded stockade as the noose was placed around Collins's neck in what remains the most witnessed execution in U.S. history. Starving and despairing, they were glad to see the demise of a man who had heaped misery on their already pitiful lives inside Andersonville prisoner of war camp. But the extraordinary story of William Collins had yet another twist. The American Civil War was fought in 1,000 places for 1,000 reasons. Friendships, unions, and even families were torn asunder by fundamentally opposing viewpoints. Centralized government versus the rights of the states, the wealth disparity between the North and the South, most vitally, the desire to bring an end to slavery. Sitting almost exactly at the midway point between the Battle of Waterloo and the beginning of the First World War, it acted as something of a bridge between the old world and the new, marking a decisive end to the gallant cavalry charges and romanticized notions of warfare from the former, ushering in the era of artillery-fueled carnage seen on a much larger scale in the latter. It was the first conflict in which weaponry rapidly outgrew tactics, enabling carnage on a scale previously thought unimaginable. Fought by the grandsons of the men who had battled Britain for independence less than a century before, it was the desperate, pitiless fight for the soul of a young country taking place over 4 blood-soaked years, every day of which saw a battle of some scale between 1861 and 1865. It remains the deadliest war in American history, with a human cost higher than the losses suffered in World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korea, Iraq, and Afghanistan combined. The town of Winchester in the Shenandoah Valley changed hands 72 times during the conflict. Generals on either side were frequently friends and former comrades of one another, and Robert E. Lee, the leader of the Confederate forces, had originally been offered command of the opposing Union Army by President Abraham Lincoln. The American Civil War was as ugly and frenzied as it was intimate. Despite being confined to one country, the war had distinctively international undertones. Over a quarter of the 2 million soldiers that fought in President Abraham Lincoln's army were born outside of the U.S., including a large percentage of recent immigrants from Britain. While the majority of them fought for the North, some did take up arms for the Southern Confederate cause, leading to bizarre examples of entirely Irish regiments squaring off against each other for a cause that wasn't even their own, shattering companionships and rekindling old rivalries on battlefields thousands of miles away from home. The story of the war is deeply and irrevocably intertwined with the story of Britain. No sooner were men from all corners of the Isles arriving on the shores of America in search of a better life when rifles and uniforms were being thrust into their hands. Although boasting impressive size and stature, William Collins was the furthest thing from an ideal soldier. Born in Nottingham at some time around 1835, his childhood was spent learning the knitting trade before, at age just 13, sailing to New York Harbor aboard a ship aptly named the America, with his 11-year-old sister Charlotte and a woman named Louisa Smallwood, who was possibly their grandmother. By the time the Civil War had begun, Louisa Smallwood was dead, his sister Charlotte was lost to history, and William had been living in Philadelphia for as many years as he lived in Nottingham. Considering the many blotches that would later appear in his service record, it's something of a surprise that he voluntarily joined the 88th Pennsylvania Infantry less than 6 months after the war's commencement. Perhaps, given that the last U.S. Census in which Collins appears lists him as having no known profession, the appeal of regular meals and pay was worth the risk of being killed in action. At the time of his enrollment, the 88th was still in the process of being outfitted, and Collins soon found himself being bounced from company to company, including being moved twice in the same day in 1862. Suggesting he was seen as problematic from the outset, ending up in Company D, a unit notorious for its discipline problems and the natural landing place for troublemakers. Regimental muster rolls show him as being absent without leave for 2 of his first 4 months in uniform. Later records show Collins as having run up a sizable debt to the regiment, presumably for lost or damaged uniforms and arms. Collins' first taste of action came at a time when Lincoln's army was firmly on the back foot, and he found himself being wounded in the thigh and captured by Confederate soldiers on the final day of the Second Battle of Bull Run in August of 1862. Paroled back as part of a prisoner exchange 3 days later, he was sent to the hospital, where he remained, missing 2 of the war's most iconic battles at Antietam and Fredericksburg. The relative comfort of hospital life was infinitely preferable to endless days spent marching, training, and fighting, as by the time he was expected to rejoin his unit in January of the following year, Collins had disappeared. However, 2 months later, he saw what many believe was the defining turning point in the entire war, Gettysburg. Fought over 3 days in early July 1863, the Battle of Gettysburg is ascribed mythological status in the annals of U.S. history. The subject of countless books, films, and podcasts, it serves as the moment in which the tides of fortune finally turned in favor of the Union side, delivering President Abraham Lincoln the victory he so desperately needed. It was no drubbing. The casualties were relatively equal on both sides. But while the Union Army could afford to lose men, the Confederates simply could not, and the perceived invincibility of Lee's army had been permanently shattered. After Gettysburg, it was no longer possible for the Confederacy to win the war, wrote historian Bruce Catton. The North might still lose it, to be sure, but outright defeat was no longer in the cards. The battle seems to have been as much of a personal turning point for Collins as it was the Union. The soldier, whose history until that point was little more than a list of unauthorized absences, faked injuries, drunkenness, and debt, was part of Baxter's brigade, fighting fiercely on Oak Ridge on the Union's right flank. Ferociously defending the hill from 3 Confederate brigades, the 88th charged over a wall to capture 2 regimental colors, as well as the survivors of the 23rd North Carolina, the unit they'd just decimated, inflicting a staggering 80% casualties. The records show that Collins and his fellow troublemakers in Company D were the first over the wall, and despite his checkered past, Collins performed well enough to receive the battlefield promotion to corporal. To this day, his name remains engraved on the plaque dedicated to the exploits of the 88th Pennsylvania on the Pennsylvania Monument at Gettysburg. Gettysburg was to be an anomaly in Collins's military experience. 3 months later, the 88th was undertaking a series of night maneuvers deep in the heart of the Confederate Northern Virginia when Collins used the cover of a moonless night to slip away from his unit, deserting for the second time. Unfortunately for Collins, it wouldn't be a mildly irritated Union surgeon that caught him this time, but Confederate soldiers. Prisoner of war records show him arriving at Belle Isle Prison Camp in Richmond, Virginia, just 24 hours later. It was here that William Collins, the infamous villain of U.S. folklore, was born. Adopting the nickname Mosby after a Confederate general that led small, quick, and unexpected raids against the enemy, the tall, physically intimidating Collins abandoned any notion of fraternal togetherness by forming and leading a gang of thugs and thieves to prey on his fellow prisoners. At this point in the war, the South was being blockaded on all sides, and rations were in short supply for the Confederate Army. Historian Larry J. Daniels writes that the desperate Confederates were forced to beg, borrow, and steal food from wherever they could find it, and often dedicated as much time in the search for provisions as they did for preparing for battle. With no flour, sugar, or coffee, men relied on their own coffee concoction made from chicory roots, acorns, sweet potatoes, and peanuts, and ate hard, spoiled cornbread which they crudely roasted over fires upon their bayonets. This is how the soldiers, the most precious commodity the South had, were treated, so you can only imagine how little was available for the Union prisoners under their watch. For Collins, it was a Darwinian decision, and if it was to be survival of the fittest, he was going to do whatever he could to make sure he survived. But his behavior didn't go unnoticed, as on March 4th, 1864, he was transferred to Camp Sumter, more commonly known as Andersonville Prison. In a war already littered with unimaginable horrors, it's hard to describe Andersonville without falling into hyperbole. Robert H. Kellogg, who was sent there as a prisoner in May of 1864, wrote, "As we entered the place, a spectacle met our eyes that almost froze our blood with horror and made our hearts fail within us. Before us were the forms that had once been active and erect, stalwart men, now nothing but mere walking skeletons covered with filth and vermin. Many of our men, in the heat and intensity of their feeling, exclaimed with eagerness, 'Can this be hell? God protect us!' In the center of the whole was a swamp, occupying about 3 or 4 acres of the narrowed limits, and a part of this marshy place had been used by the prisoners as a sink, and excrement covered the ground, the scent arising from which was suffocating. Now we were to live through the warm summer. How we were to live through the warm summer weather in the midst of such fearful surroundings was more than we cared to think of just then. Built over 10 acres and roughly 1,000 feet by 800 feet in size, Andersonville was originally intended to hold around 9,000 Union prisoners of war. At its most crowded, it was packed with almost 45,000. With little to no food, barely any clean water supply, and hellish sanitary conditions, death stalked the camp on a daily basis, claiming over 13,000 of the prisoners kept there. At its worst, the death rate was over 100 per day. While scurvy, diarrhea, dysentery, and starvation were the chief causes, more than a few men's lives were violently ended at the hands of their fellow prisoners. The move into Andersonville did little to curb Collins's behavior. If anything, the more extreme conditions fueled increasingly extreme behavior. His gang grew larger, becoming known as both Mosby's Raiders and Collins's Raiders, and the attacks grew more carefully choreographed. With so many people packed into such a small space, an ecosystem of bartering, shops, and alliances naturally evolved, and as with any such rudimentary system, strength of force was the only true currency. New arrivals at the camp would be lured into a tent with the promise of a welcoming meal and a warm cup of coffee, only to be severely beaten, sometimes fatally, and their clothes, possessions, food, and valuables stripped away. At some point, Collins moved from being the thief to the thief conductor, as several surviving diaries record him as being absent from the events themselves, but well known as the chief orchestrator, a Fagin-type figure pulling the strings of his desperate, nefarious band of degenerates. He was preying on men who had given everything for a cause they believed in, and now found themselves at their lowest ebb. Prisoner exchanges had become too complicated to function, and their hopes of freedom from the notorious camp lay only with the conclusion of a war, which was still over a year away. It was a terrible time, says a Sunday Mercury newspaper article from August of 1865. But what appeared to be every man's business was nobody's business, and no man dared grapple with this inhumane organization. A reign of terror had spread itself over the prison as men lay down in the miserable tents at night in terror, and they woke in the morning unrefreshed, the terrors of the banditti still haunting them. It was a truly desperate situation of which Collins was taking full advantage. Collins's raiders were far from the only group operating in such a way. At least 5 other bands ran similar schemes of separating and attacking weaker prisoners, often working in unison with one another. Whether because of his physical size, his bright red hair, or his ruthless, violent reputation, Collins is the most written about of them all. Because the gangs moved fast and in shows of strength, there was little the victims could do to avoid being attacked. But this was to change with the arrival of the Plymouth Pilgrims, a group of 2,364 Union soldiers who had been captured in North Carolina. As part of their terms of surrender, the Plymouth captives had been allowed to keep their cash and property, which, as it happened, included 3 months' worth of back pay, as well as enlistment and re-enlistment bounties. This influx of cash into the camp, which would have been the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars in modern currency, would change life at Andersonville completely. The increase of wealth brought a sharp rise in crime, as prisoner diaries recount attacks becoming more and more violent and brazen. But as the attacks rose, so did the effort to combat them. Wanting to protect the cash they'd been allowed to keep, the new influx of wealthy prisoners developed a system of screaming Plymouth at the first sign of an attack, bringing their comrades streaming out to their defense. Bands of informal regulators began to form, tasked with acting as an ad hoc police force of sorts. Sometimes these methods were enough to deter the attempted robberies and beatings, and sometimes the raiders simply bided their time and waited for a more opportune moment. With some semblance of law established, punishments started to be meted out for those caught in the act of attempting to steal from a fellow prisoner. Eugene Forbes, a prisoner at Andersonville who kept a meticulous diary during his time there, recounted several such incidents. Thursday, May 26th. Some of the dirtiest men were sucked and scrubbed today, and some of the raiders bucked and gagged, and their heads shaved. Wednesday, June 20th. The raiders were hunted from one end of the camp to the other. About 50 were taken outside, and their issuings of rations stopped. Large quantities of clothing, blankets, and currency were found in some raiders' tents. Thursday, June 22nd. Our own men are worse to each other than the rebels are to us. Heard a chase after a raider after we had turned in. Don't think they caught him. At some point during these back-and-forth skirmishes, the brother of a man known as Limber Jim was killed by the raiders, possibly by Collins himself, or at least at his order. The camp's commandant, a Swiss-American named Captain Henry Wurz, who would later be hanged of war crimes due to the brutal conditions at Andersonville, finally decided to intercede. Collins and 5 of the other ringleaders, Charles Curtis, John Sarsfield, Patrick Delaney, Terry Sullivan, and Alvin T. Mune, were hunted down and arrested. The raiders' reign of terror was finally over. Such was the outpouring of vengeance against the raiders that Wirtz had a job on his hands to prevent them from being lynched there and then. An impromptu trial followed, during which the majority of the arrested men, who numbered somewhere between 50 and 75, were given punishments ranging from having their heads shaved to being forced to run the gauntlet, the process of being led between 2 lines of their victims, who, having been armed with bats and clubs, were permitted to beat them as they passed. Several were thrashed with such fury that they later died from their injuries. But for Collins and the 5 other gang leaders, there could only be one penalty, and as the sun set over the hastily assembled gallows in Andersonville Prison, William Collins knew his luck had finally run out. The surviving court transcripts paints a despicable picture, describing how Collins and his men lived as slum kings, while his former brothers-in-arms were subjected to treatment of the very worst kind. Against the already hellish landscape of Andersonville, their already slim chances of survival were reduced further by the selfish barbarism of the raiders. As the 6 men were led up to the gallows steps, none who had suffered at the hands missed the opportunity to witness their execution. The waters of history are muddy at the best of times, and the conditions in which Andersonville diaries were kept were far from the best of times. While details from the different records often contradict one another, all those who wrote about what happened at the execution of William Collins agree with what occurred next. The 6 prisoners seemed stunned, writes historian Gary Morgan. Several witnesses would later write that they had the impression that the 6 had not actually believed that they were about to die until that moment. But their arrest, trial, and sentence were no elaborate ploy to bring them into line. One of the 6 attempted to flee through the prisoner's latrine just as he came to the gallows steps, but was quickly brought to heel. Cloth meal sacks were placed over the condemned men's heads and nooses fixed around their throats. At the signal given by their executioner, the prop holding the platform on which they stood was knocked away, plummeting the 6 men into the abyss. Sputtering and coughing, a bemused William Collins opened his eyes to see a crowd of faces staring down at him. Was this the afterlife? It looked as grim and dismal as the prison camp in which he'd just shuffled off his mortar coil. Looking around as he slowly came to his senses, he saw the dangling corpses of his 5 former associates swinging behind him. This was no paradise. His rope had just snapped, sending him crashing into the mud and knocking him unconscious. Surely this was a sign from God, and the Almighty had seen fit to spare him punishment for his wicked crimes. At least that was the claim he made to the unsatisfied mob as he pleaded for his life. But his pleas fell on deaf ears as Limber Jim, the man whose brother Collins had reportedly murdered, lifted the large frame man over his shoulder as if he was a baby, and carried him back onto the scaffold to be hanged for a second time. This time, the rope held just fine. Collins and the 5 other raid leaders were not permitted to be buried with the other fallen prisoners, and their names were not counted amongst the honored dead, a sentiment that continues to this day. When the thousands of graves at Andersonville National Cemetery are decorated with American flags each Memorial Day, the 6 graves of Collins and the other leaders sit to the side, yards away from the rest, unflagged, unhonored, and forgotten.
It's your history. Learn it, know it, love it. Like and follow so you don't miss any of the exciting episodes from Mad Hatter's Civil War history.